Okay, before entering the removal and analysis of the cuff, I just want to bring something to your attention. You have to make notes and you have to keep track of everything when you're getting orders in the mail. And what you're looking at is what I created years ago. It's a tag form. You may call yours order form, whatever you want to call it. You need general information, name, address, email, phone number, and then what you're offering. And in this particular case, this is for collars and cuffs. But a lot of times customers won't understand what you're talking about. Make same length. Well, is that the length from left to right, or is it the length in extending from the sleeve length? So you have to make these things clear, and usually they don't understand. You'll have to send them an email. Maybe you'll send them a diagram or a photograph explaining what you mean. When you lay a cuff flat, the length is from left to right, and the height is from top to bottom. And so you have to make these, explain them. You have to make sure that they understand shrinkage. And also, the question is, do the cuffs fit you now? And if they don't, explain it to what you should do or how much you should add. How much do you want them to tell you to add? And all the general information as to, payment and your mailing address, and specifically to make their email clear so that if you have questions, you can contact them. One of the biggest problems that I've had over the years is email. They print them so lousy you can't even read the emails. And many times I have to call them and ask them, what is your email? And a lot of times when they don't even give you a phone number, what I've gone is to Google and search their address, and ultimately I find out what their emails are. So there's many ways of researching, but this is just something to keep in mind. And also, this tag form I attach to the shirt so that it never get lost, because in the beginning you may only have one shirt, two shirts, whatever. But when you start getting 10, 15, and 20 shirts a week, how are you going to keep control of it? How do you know whose shirt is what and what has to be done? So it's very important. And I'm going to explain all these things as we go along the course. So keep this in mind. Develop your own form, or you can copy mine if you want. But I'll show you many ways of how to work. Is very important, because I highly recommend you start working out of your home or your apartment in the beginning. Rents are very expensive today. Expenses starting a business are very expensive. And when you haven't done one shirt, it's extremely expensive. So start out at the bottom, as I suggest in these tutorials. And let's start the cuff removal and analysis. Okay, let's get started. You just seen the segment on the tag form. But getting going here with the removal, these are the tools that I will be using. Water-soluble pens. In the old days, we never used them. There's always a method. There's always a system that somebody develops. A pencil, toothpick knife, foldable sharp blade, very sharp. A T-pin, it's just regular small scissors, tweezers, and my good old handy Klaus embroidery, very sharp points on them. One of the best tools I have, and also a safety pin. And as we go through the tutorial, I'll explain all these tools. And you don't have to have all of them. In the beginning, I never had the water soluble. I never had the Klaus. I developed methods for using the safety pin and the T-pin. So many things are going to happen to you during your career. So it's very important to learn, become knowledgeable as you're progressing through your learning stages. Things will pop into your mind, and try them, and if they work, keep them. But anyway, these are the tools that I will be using, and we're going to get into the analysis. I'm going to move the tools up a little bit out of the way and bring in the actual the cuff that we'll be looking at. Now, this shirt was submitted. It's a well-known brand. It's probably over $100 when it was first purchased, and $100, over $100 back. This shirt is probably 20 years old, but you can see they got a lot of wear and tear. The edges are all frayed. We're going to use the same length. The reason I'm saying is, when you're measuring all these items, it's very important to take the measurements. So in this particular case, this cuff is 2 3/4 inches. And normally what I do is I'll write right on them, since they're damaged anyway, 2 3/4 wide. And the length on this particular one will be 10 inches. This is what it is now, but I'm sure this cuff is probably shrunk already. And that's the key, is to know what your customer's telling you, because he might have put on weight. I'm sure if you purchased these 20 years ago, he's probably heavier than he was, and this cuff is probably shrunk. It probably was 10 1/2, 10 3/4 probably in the beginning. So ask the questions. And you notice it's a 2-button. And also notice the pleats. There's 2 pleats on there. You can mark them if you want, but if you're making them bigger or smaller, it'll be irrelevant. But you can do that. I'll show you techniques of how to discover if you lose the pleats, how to make up on it. I want to just make a point here that in the beginning, when you take the course, I always recommend that you take all the tutorials. And the reason being is because a lot of times when I'm explaining things, I'll mention words that you don't even know what I'm talking about. And that's the rationality behind watching the tutorials from A to Z all the way through before you start the course. It's like learning a language. You know, you can be taught the ABCs of the language, but until you start speaking and seeing the things that are associated with the language, you have no idea what's going on. And it's the same thing in shirt making. There's a lot of details, a lot of techniques that you can learn just by watching them, so that when that relevant tutorial comes up, you'll have a greater understanding of how it works. So again, I've made the analysis that it's 10 long. Customer says it's okay. It's 2 3/4 wide. And here we're going to start taking the cuff, removing the cuff. And normally what I do is I'll use a toothpick knife to get it started. And I'll stick it in. Now, this one's not too bad. Some of these cuffs have 22 stitches per inch. It's so small that you can barely see them. And this is why, in a lot of cases, I will use the T-pin, just so I can prick it. Now, if you've watched all the tutorials like I recommended, you'll know that I use a magnifying headset when the stitches are too small to be able to open them up, start it. And in this case, I didn't have to do that. And once I open it up, then what I do is I go to my foldable sharp knife, and I'll start to, again, tap it. And you can barely, you can hear them snapping. Now, be careful with the older cuffs because they're old and the fabrics are starting to rot, especially along the seam line. So you don't want to rip down into the sleeve. You can imagine if you rip down 1 inch, well, you own that shirt. So be very careful of, I usually put my palm in that area, and this is what I normally do. And now this one's going to be easy, I can see, because both the sleeve and the cuff were stitched at the same time. There's no 2-stitch process here. So you can see that it's come loose pretty well. Okay. So you can see it came out real well. You notice that there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark it. I'm going to mark the seam line so you can see it. And the reason being, in fact, I'm going to use a darker Sharpie. Obviously, you wouldn't do this on yours, but so I'm going to mark it with a Sharpie on that stitch line. And you can see where it's a stitch line. And so there's about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, a lot of times when you're taking these cuffs, removing them, they're rotted, and because there's 22 stitches per inch, they break and they tear, and they could tear down 1/8 or 1/4 inch down. So ultimately what you'll have to do is you'll have to reduce the sleeve length by that amount just to cover it. And I'll show you a repair process that I use. And also what ultimately happens in that situation where the sleeve is reduced, I make the cuff wider. So in this particular case, it was 2 3/4. I would make that 3 inch. And you know, the customer, you know, they never have a problem because you explain it. Hey, you know, the shirts are 20 years old, and this is what happened, and that's the only way I can make it. The sleeve length will remain the same, so they have no problem with it. It still will be a 2-button, and you know, so it's going to come out perfect. But what ultimately will happen is that along this torn stitch line on the wrong side, we'll fuse some very light fusing on it, and we'll use the fusing machine to make sure it's permanent, and I'll show you that in another process. But for now, we have removed the cuff, and we know that it's a 2-button. And a lot of times when you get these cuffs, many times they will be 2-button, and if he's telling you to make it bigger, most likely you can go to just a 2-button instead of a 4-button, because you have his length now. You know that the original ones were too small. So again, you can calculate. You can ask him, does he have a shirt that fits him perfect, a cuff that fits him perfect? And if he measures from left to right, then you know it's going to be just one set of buttons instead of 4 buttons on it. And that goes for single barrel cuffs as far as the 2-button cuffs. So these are questions you ask to make your job easier. And again, I would make all these notations on my tag form. It's very important to make these notations. So we've gone through the analysis and we've gone through the removal. Everything looks pretty good. There's no rips on it at all. So again, I'm going to show you what I normally do, even though what I don't want to do is I don't want to stitch back in the original. This was the original stitch here. Let me just get that in there. So normally what I do is I reduce it to a 1/4 inch, and I take all that excess off. And the reason being is because I don't want to stitch back in that same stitch line. It's already weak. So I basically, from a half, I went to less than a 1/4 because I want my new stitch to be less than. Okay. So now my stitch line, new stitch line, is going to be here. You can see here. And I'll stitch just a hair beneath that, ensuring that I don't stitch in the same holes that were before. And usually when you get 22 stitches per inch, they're the worst culprits. You know, they talk about it being strong because it's 22 stitches per inch. Initially, it is very strong. But when you have to replace them, all those holes have really become solid. You can imagine putting 22 holes in 1 inch side by side. Try it with a needle and paper, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And they will rip. And this is what happens in most cases. Now, this was not 22 stitches, and it's in very good shape. So there's no holes. So it's very easy. So in the next segment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the process of the fusing repair when you get these cuffs. Okay, we're in the final segment here of this tutorial. We've cut down our sleeve end, and we have some little tears beyond the actual stitch line, which I've marked here in a blue pen. I cut myself a fusible. Make sure you get the glue side. Now we're on the wrong side, and your whole purpose is to make sure that it covers that tear by at least 1/8 of an inch. And don't be so much concerned with what sticks beyond the edge of the sleeve. But right now, what we're doing is we're just going to stitch it. We're going to just fuse it temporarily. And our whole purpose is just to keep it in place and then take it to the fusing machine. I can't stress this enough. Make sure you take it to the fusing. This must be permanent. Make sure you get it and it doesn't come loose. Now, ultimately, what will happen is when you trim it to a 1/8. Now I'm just going to simulate here. I'm going to trim it to where my seam line is going to be a 1/4 inch. Now this has already come from the fusing machine. Ultimately, what I'll end up doing is on the wrong side, I will end up doing a very small stitch, matching the color of the thread to the fabric, just slightly, little small stitches, just to reinforce what you've already permanently fused. And this will ensure that it won't come loose, and that when you have a new stitch line, it'll be a free zone. In other words, there's no holes there previously. And that's what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid stitching it back where it was original, because there's too many holes there. And when you try to restitch it, it weakens. And you want these things to last. You want the reputation of make sure that it sticks together. Now, when you're removing this, you may have different places. You may have one here, you may have one there. Wherever it is, you have to do the same procedure all the way through. Now, some of these techniques will apply the same to your collar. But since we're working on the cuff, we'll stick with cuffs here. Again, take it to the fusing machine, make sure it's fused, test it, make sure it doesn't come loose. You may reinforce it with a small stitch, and then from there on, it's forming your pleats and attaching it to the cuff again. Again, I can't stress going through all the videos. Many times it's very difficult to tell you everything about one segment when there's so much previously that has to be known. So watch all the videos from A to Z. I'll give you a great understanding of each individual tutorial as you approach them. Let's finish up here, and I'll give you a few tips and clues of what and how to be organized. Always, when you've done your patterns and you finish with your samples, you've trimmed it, whatever you've done, the safety pin, I always attach it to the shirt I'm working on until I've terminated the job. And the other thing I do is I take a tack form, and I always attach it to the bottom with all my notes and stuff. And if you have 100 shirts, every shirt has a tack form or order form, whatever you want to call it. You'll have all your notes on this tag form, every conversation you've had with a customer. I can't stress, when you get the shirts in the beginning, you have to inspect them. Now, I'm going to show you one here that this one we're working on now. There is a rip on it, and this customer didn't even realize it. We've called him. We're going to repair it for him. I'm going to use the interfacing technique and then use a zigzag, or what you can do is turn it to the wrong side and just create a seam much like a dart and close it up. I've never charged for this service. If they let me know what's going on, or if I see it, I'll fix it free of charge. It's just a service that I've provided as long as I've been in the business. So it's very important, because when you see something like this, take a photograph, get your phone out, take a snapshot, send it to the customer, and immediately when you open the box, tell them, listen, you have a hole in your shirt. Because if you don't, and you send the shirt back and you haven't done anything to it, they're going to blame you. Invariably, you're going to be in trouble. And you don't want to be in that situation disputing, because most likely they never inspect your shirts. They never inspect them. I found that 99.9% of the time they never know what they send you. They send them to the laundry, they've been laundered, they're folded up, they don't try them on, they don't even know how they fit. So inspect them, make notes of any rips, tears. If you want to fix them or if you want to charge for it, that's up to you. But that's what I do. And then in the end, when you finish the job, I taught myself years ago, I have these little baggies, clear baggies with a zip top on them. I put the customer's name, the date I did the job, I created all the patterns in it. The tag forms are in there, one tag form for each shirt. I've got samples of the old, in this particular case, collars. We did some collars. I have all the collars in there and all the patterns for that particular job and the tag form. And what I do is I save them for 30 days. Because if they come back at you, like I said, usually they don't pay any attention. They're excited about sending them to you, and they don't take the time to inspect their own shirts. They could be stained. They could be a lot of things, mustard on them, ketchup, and they don't even realize that they have it on, and they're going to blame you. You're going to ultimately be responsible. So that's the first thing when you open a bath. Inspect them, analyze them, make your patterns, protect yourself at all costs, and keep them for at least 30 days. Uh, Many times I keep them longer, especially if they're steady customers, because they'll use the same patterns every time. They say, well, do you have the old pattern? But I have a separate file for that. I have a file on hand of old customers that order the same thing year after year, and those be separate. So there's many ways of handling the organization, but that's how I keep track of everything. That's how I protect myself.